There are a number of reasons to implement Client Hyper-V, including to run multiple operating systems on a single computer, to support older applications that don't work properly when running natively on Windows 10, to create a test environment that will not affect your production machine. The requirements for Client Hyper-V are that you must implement a 64-bit version of Windows 10 Pro, Windows 10 Enterprise or Windows 10 Education. You must have a 64-bit processor that supports the following features: hardware-assisted virtualization, data execution prevention, and second-level address translation. You'll require at least 4 GB of physical memory, plus additional memory for any of your virtual machines. Plenty of storage for your virtual machines. And ideally a fast disk subsystem such as an SSD. Assuming your computer meets those requirements, to install Client Hyper-V, enable the feature through Turn Windows Features On or Off in Control Panel. Select the checkbox for the Hyper-V management tools and for the Hyper-V platform. If you're unable to select the Hyper-V platform, it suggests that your computer does not meet the hardware requirements. Either that, or you haven't enabled the virtualization features in your UEFI settings. You can also use the Windows PowerShell Enable Windows Optional Feature commandlet. Once you've enabled the Hyper-V feature, the next thing is to create virtual switches. These enable you to connect your machines to networks. They can be private, which means that only the virtual machines can communicate on that private virtual switch. Internal, which means the virtual machines and the local host can communicate on the virtual switch. Or external, which means that you can communicate with virtual machines on the interface, with the host on the interface, and with other hosts and their virtual machines connected to the same external interface. The next step is to configure virtual hard disks. You'll be prompted for a disk format. VHD is an older format and supports virtual hard disks up to about 2040 GB in size. VHDX is the current format and is recommended, and supports much larger virtual disk sizes and provides a degree of resilience. This format is not supported in operating systems earlier than Windows 8. You'll next need to choose the disk type. A fixed disk provides for better performance, but, as the name suggests, has a fixed size and therefore consumes a larger amount of disk space. Dynamically expanding requires a little bit more oomph from the local computer to manage, growing the disk as needed, but it's more efficient of disk space. A differencing disk is perhaps the most efficient of disk space. It provides the difference between a parent virtual disk and the local configuration of the computer. So if you have a number of virtual machines that have a very similar configuration, consider creating them all based on a particular differencing disk with one parent. Then you'll need to specify a name and a path to store the virtual hard disk. You can specify that a hard disk is blank, or that it starts off as a copy of a specified physical disk, or that it starts off as the copy of a specified virtual hard disk. After you've created your virtual hard disks, you need to create a virtual machine, during which time you'll specify the following information. First of all, a name for the virtual machine. Next, where you want to store the virtual machine configuration files. The generation of the machine, you can choose between Generation 1 and Generation 2. Generation 1 virtual machines support 32-bit and 64-bit guest operating systems, whereas Generation 2 support more advanced features but only 64-bit guest operating systems. The default is Generation 2. Memory, you can specify an initial amount of memory and a maximum amount of memory, or a fixed amount of memory. If you choose an initial and a maximum, then you're configuring dynamic memory. This is probably the most efficient use of memory on your physical computer. Rather than allocating a fixed amount which may not be used by the virtual machine, you can allocate a variable amount with an upper limit. You'll need to specify a virtual switch that you want to connect the virtual machine to, if indeed it will connect to any virtual switch. And then virtual hard disks. You can create a virtual hard disk during the creation of a virtual machine, or you can point the configuration to an existing hard disk that you previously created. If you want to install an operating system, you can also specify to launch an installation program from an ISO file or a physical DVD. Once you've created the virtual machine, you can configure its additional settings. The configurable options include adding hardware such as a network adapter, SCSI controller, or a remote FX3D video adapter, specifying BIOS. That might include options such as certain features within the BIOS or UEFI, or the startup order, whether you're going to boot from DVD or boot from the hard disk or whatever. You can reconfigure memory, specifying either a fixed amount or an upper or lower amount. You can configure how many processors can be allocated to the virtual machine. You can add additional IDE or SCSI controllers to support more hard disks or DVD drives. You can configure additional network adapters,